Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. Imagine standing on the banks of the Ohio River in 1870, not at a state line, but at an international border. Uniformed guards check documents. Cargo is inspected. What was once the interior of a single country now feels like a frontier between two nations. This world would not exist because the South defeated the North. It would exist because the North decided to stop fighting. The American Civil War was never only a contest of armies. It was a test of how long one side was willing to keep paying the price to force the country back together. From the beginning, the Confederacy understood this. It did not need to conquer Washington or destroy the Union Army. It only needed the Union to decide that reunion by force was no longer worth the cost. If that decision were ever made, independence would arrive quietly, not as triumph, but as acceptance. And once that choice was taken, everything that followed would not be speculation, but consequence. By the spring of 1861, the United States was already breaking apart before the war truly began. Southern states left the Union not in response to violence, but in anticipation of political loss. They believed that remaining inside the federal system no longer protected their economic structure or social order. Secession was a decision made in advance of the fighting, not a reaction to it. When the first battles were fought, both sides carried expectations that would soon prove misplaced. In the North, many assumed the conflict would be brief, a show of force sufficient to restore order. In the South, leaders expected the opposite. They believed time favored them, not because they were stronger, but because they were defending a narrower goal. That difference defined the war's underlying logic. The Confederacy never planned to defeat the Union in a conventional sense. Its leaders understood the imbalance in population, industry, and finance too clearly. Instead, Confederate strategy was built around endurance. Survival itself was the objective, because survival imposed costs the Union would have to justify again and again. This reframed what victory meant. For the Union, victory required forcing the states back into the nation. For the Confederacy, victory meant convincing the Union to stop trying. Every month the war continued without resolution tested Northern tolerance. Every costly campaign raised the same question in different forms. How much was reunion worth? That question was not asked only in government offices. It surfaced in households where absence became permanent, in workplaces disrupted by conscription and inflation, and in newspapers that no longer promised a quick end. The war effort depended not only on generals and armies, but on a civilian population that had to consent to continued sacrifice. This dynamic turned the conflict into a contest of endurance rather than domination. Confederate armies did not need decisive victories. They needed to avoid collapse. Time became their most valuable resource. For Northern leaders, success on the battlefield was no longer enough. Each year of fighting required renewed political justification, renewed public patience, and renewed belief that force could still achieve its goal. The outcome of the war would therefore hinge on decisions made far from the front lines. The Confederacy could not force the Union to surrender, but it could attempt to make victory feel disproportionate to its cost. If the Union ever concluded that restoring the nation by force no longer justified the losses, the war would end, not with defeat, but with a decision. Understanding this is essential to understanding how the South could have won. Confederate independence would not emerge from overwhelming strength or decisive conquest. It would emerge from exhaustion, calculation, and acceptance. And if that moment arrived, the end of the war would not resolve the conflict that created it. It would only move that conflict into a new and more enduring form. As the war dragged into its second year, the gap between expectation and reality in the North widened. Early confidence had been built on the belief that force would restore order quickly. Instead, battles produced lists of casualties without closure. Victories were expensive, defeats were unsettling, and neither brought the end any closer. The promise of a short war faded into something harder to explain. This strain moved quickly from the battlefield into civilian life. Conscription reached deeper into communities that had expected to support the war from a distance. Prices rose as supply chains bent under military demand. Families adjusted to absence not as a temporary disruption, but as an open-ended condition. Support for the war did not disappear, but it became conditional, tied to the belief that sacrifice would eventually pay off. That belief faced constant challenge. Newspapers debated strategy and purpose with increasing urgency. Political leaders were forced to justify not only how the war was being fought, but why it still needed to be fought at all. Elections continued, and with them came a public reckoning the Confederacy did not face. Northern leaders governed under the pressure of consent, aware that legitimacy could erode faster than armies could recover. Within this environment, the idea of negotiation began to lose its taboo. For some, compromise was not a betrayal of the Union, but a recognition of limits. If the war could not be concluded decisively, then prolonging it risked weakening the very nation it was meant to preserve. This argument did not require admiration for the South. It required doubt that force alone could achieve reunion. The Confederacy's strategy depended on this doubt. Southern leaders could not create Northern opposition, but they could wait for it. Every inconclusive campaign reinforced the sense that the war was becoming a test of tolerance rather than strength. Time worked against Northern certainty, even when armies advanced. Endurance, not victory, became the measure that mattered most. This shift did not announce itself dramatically. There was no single moment when the North decided it had had enough. Instead, hesitation accumulated. Each year without resolution reframed the conflict from a necessary struggle into an open question. At some point, that question would demand an answer, not on the battlefield, but in the political sphere. If that answer favored ending the war, it would not be framed as surrender. It would be framed as calculation. The Union would weigh continued sacrifice against uncertain reward and decide that the cost of forcing reunion had grown too high. And once that decision was made, independence would no longer be a failure to prevent, but an outcome to manage. If the war ended through decision rather than collapse, the moment of peace would arrive without celebration. Neither side would feel victorious in the way wars are usually remembered. The Union would have chosen to stop fighting without restoring the nation. The Confederacy would have secured independence without proving it could sustain it. The terms of separation would reflect restraint, not triumph. This restraint would be shaped by necessity. North and South had been built as parts of a single economic system, and that reality could not be undone by political agreement alone. Rail lines still crossed former state boundaries. River traffic still linked inland markets to coastal ports. Northern factories still depended on Southern cotton, while Southern exporters still relied on Northern shipping, credit, and insurance. Independence changed the legal framework, but not the underlying dependence. As a result, the early post-war years would be marked by pragmatic cooperation. Diplomatic recognition would come with conditions, and trade would resume under careful supervision. Public language might remain bitter, but policy would favor stability over revenge. Neither government could afford renewed conflict, and both governed populations exhausted by years of sacrifice. For the Confederacy, this period would be especially fragile. Independence delivered sovereignty, but not strength. The new state lacked the industrial base and financial depth needed to operate in isolation. Access to foreign markets and capital would be essential for survival, and that access required predictability. Confederate leaders would quickly learn that political separation did not guarantee economic freedom. The Union, meanwhile, would adjust its priorities. Preventing renewed war would matter more than reversing the outcome. Border security, trade continuity, and internal recovery would outweigh the desire to punish secession. The focus would shift from reunification to management, of borders, of commerce, and of a relationship that could not simply be severed. This uneasy balance would define the meaning of independence. The Confederacy would exist, recognized and sovereign, but constrained by the same connections it had hoped to escape. Separation had ended the war, but it had not erased interdependence. And beneath that fragile peace lay a deeper question, whether the new nation could reconcile its internal foundations with the demands of the world it now faced alone. Slavery had survived the war, but independence changed the conditions under which it existed. Inside the Union, it had been one issue among many contested within a vast political system that diffused responsibility. As a sovereign state, the Confederacy could no longer rely on that diffusion. Slavery was no longer a regional controversy inside a larger nation. It was now a defining feature of a country seeking legitimacy on its own. In the immediate aftermath of independence, Confederate leaders would treat this as a manageable problem. Slavery was embedded in law, economy, and social hierarchy. It organized labor, concentrated wealth, and secured political loyalty among those who governed. Removing it would destabilize the very order the new state had been created to protect. In the short term, there was no incentive to act. But independence altered how the outside world engaged with the South. Trade agreements, diplomatic recognition, and access to capital were no longer mediated through Washington. Every negotiation now placed the Confederacy's internal system directly under scrutiny. Foreign governments might remain pragmatic, but they also faced pressure at home from populations that increasingly associated modern states with free labor and industrial growth. This did not translate into immediate isolation or moral confrontation. The world did business where it was profitable, yet the costs of association rose quietly. Credit became cautious. Investment came with conditions. Diplomatic support was limited and transactional. Slavery did not trigger collapse, but it narrowed the range of choices available to the new nation. For Confederate policymakers, this created a strategic bind. Preserving slavery secured internal stability, but constrained external opportunity. Challenging it promised access to markets and legitimacy, but threatened domestic cohesion. Independence did not remove this contradiction. It intensified it. Every year of survival sharpened the tension between what the Confederacy was and what it needed to become. In this way, victory transformed slavery's role. What had once been defended as the foundation of Southern prosperity now set the limits of its future. The question facing the Confederacy was no longer whether slavery could endure independence. It was how long the state could endure while carrying it. Those limits became most visible in the Confederacy's place within the global economy. Before the war, Southern leaders had believed cotton guaranteed leverage. European industry depended on it, and that dependence was assumed to be permanent. Independence seemed to confirm the logic, control the supply, command the terms. But the war itself had already begun to erode that advantage. European manufacturers, forced to adapt, expanded cotton production elsewhere and diversified their sources. These alternatives were imperfect, but they reduced vulnerability. By the time the Confederacy stood alone, its exports remained valuable, but no longer irreplaceable. The balance of dependence had shifted. That shift changed how the Confederacy was treated. Trade continued, but credit tightened. Investment arrived cautiously, priced for risk rather than confidence. Foreign governments engaged, but without committing to a state whose long-term direction appeared uncertain. Slavery did not cause a sudden break with the world, it produced a slow narrowing of opportunity. Inside the Confederacy, this pressure was felt as frustration rather than crisis. The economy functioned, but it lagged. Agriculture remained dominant longer than planned. Infrastructure expanded unevenly. Industrial growth arrived in pockets, constrained by limited capital and uncertainty about labor. Comparisons with faster-moving economies became unavoidable. The problem could not be solved with minor reforms. Industrialization required scale, capital, and predictability. Capital required trust. Trust required clarity about the future of labor and governance. As long as slavery remained central, that clarity was absent. Independence delivered sovereignty, but not the conditions needed to compete on equal terms. Over time, the debate shifted from ideology to practicality. The question was no longer whether slavery was defensible, but whether it was sustainable. Preserving it meant accepting permanent limits on growth and influence. Challenging it meant unsettling the social order that independence had been meant to secure. This was the choice independence had deferred, not avoided. The Confederacy had won the right to decide its future. What it had not secured was an easy path forward, and as economic pressure mounted, the space for delay narrowed, pushing the new nation toward decisions that would test the meaning of victory itself. If the Confederacy moved away from slavery, it would do so under compulsion rather than conviction. Economic limits, diplomatic friction, and the demands of modernization would force leaders to confront a reality. Independence had only postponed. Emancipation, if it came, would be framed as necessity, not reform, and that framing would shape every decision that followed. Ending slavery would immediately destabilize the system that had sustained Confederate rule. Enslaved labor had structured wealth, status, and authority. Its removal introduced uncertainty into labor markets and politics at the same time. For many white Southerners, the fear was not only economic competition, but the possibility that freedom would evolve into claims for participation and power. To manage that risk, Confederate policy would likely separate legal freedom from political equality. Labor could be reorganized without extending rights. Citizenship could be defined narrowly. Emancipation would be designed to preserve control rather than redistribute it. This approach would ease external pressure while limiting internal disruption, at least in theory. In practice, the gap between freedom and equality would produce persistent tension. A large population released from bondage but excluded from meaningful participation would remain economically dependent and socially constrained. Contracts, local authority, and unequal enforcement of the law would replace ownership as tools of control. Order would be maintained less through open coercion than through systems that limited choice. Maintaining those systems would demand constant attention. Courts, police, and local power brokers would become central to governance. The language of stability would justify restriction, and security would take precedence over inclusion. Independence, once defined as self-determination, would increasingly be defended as protection against disorder from within. Abolition would not resolve the Confederacy's contradictions. It would expose them. The nation created to preserve a rigid social order would now devote much of its energy to preventing that order from unraveling under modern pressure. Sovereignty would remain intact, but legitimacy would narrow. Victory had secured a state. It had not secured a society at peace with itself. As these pressures accumulated, the Confederacy's central challenge would shift from external survival to internal cohesion. Independence had removed the immediate threat posed by the Union, but it had also stripped away the unifying force of war. What remained was a state tasked with governing deep social divisions without the binding pressure of a common enemy. Demographics intensified this problem. In several Confederate states, formerly enslaved people made up a substantial share of the population. Even without political rights, their presence shaped every aspect of governance. Labor policy, security planning, and local administration were all designed around maintaining control rather than fostering inclusion. Stability was not assumed. It had to be enforced. To preserve authority, Confederate institutions would likely harden over time. Power would concentrate among aligned elites, justified as necessary for order and continuity. Civil liberties would be applied unevenly, framed not as inequality, but as pragmatism. Independence would increasingly be described not as freedom, but as protection. Protection from unrest, from external pressure, and from social change moving faster than the state could absorb. This inward focus would alter daily governance. Resources would be directed toward surveillance, enforcement, and local control rather than long-term investment. Political debate would narrow, constrained by the need to maintain stability. Innovation that threatened existing hierarchies would be treated with suspicion. The state would function, but cautiously, always guarding against disruption. Over time, this posture would erode the Confederacy's capacity for renewal. A society organized around containment struggles to adapt. Economic growth would be uneven, legitimacy fragile, and trust limited. Independence would endure, but ambition would recede. The goal of government would shift from building a future to preserving a constrained present. In this environment, victory would feel increasingly hollow. The generation that had fought for independence would fade from power, replaced by leaders managing the consequences rather than the cause. The Confederacy would survive, but survival itself would become the standard of success, an outcome far narrower than the one envisioned when secession began. The consequences of a Southern victory would not end at the Confederacy's borders. The United States that remained would have to absorb the meaning of a war it had chosen to stop fighting. Survival was never in question, but identity was. Losing the South would force the Union to redefine what federal authority could and could not compel. The political reckoning would be immediate. Leaders who had argued that force could preserve the nation would now govern a country that had accepted division. The lesson drawn by voters would not be that unity was inevitable, but that it depended on consent. Secession had not been crushed. It had succeeded. That precedent would quietly reshape future debates between states and Washington. National identity would change with it. Before the war, Americans often defined themselves through region and state. The conflict had begun to forge a stronger national consciousness, built on shared sacrifice. A negotiated end would interrupt that process. The United States would continue as a nation, but with a thinner emotional center, aware that the bond holding it together had limits. Strategically, the Union would adapt to a new reality. Continental security would matter more than projection abroad. Border defense, readiness, and deterrence would replace confidence in internal stability. The capital's proximity to a former enemy would carry symbolic weight, reinforcing the sense that the nation now lived with a permanent fracture. Economically, the North would recover and expand, but with altered assumptions. Industrial growth would continue, yet always alongside competition from a neighboring state occupying land and markets once considered internal. Western expansion would remain vital, but it would unfold with greater caution, shaped by rivalry rather than certainty. The United States that emerged would still be powerful, but more restrained. Its leaders would govern with an awareness that force had failed to hold the nation together once before. Authority would persist, but ambition would be tempered. The Union would endure, not as an experiment proven unbreakable, but as a country permanently shaped by the knowledge that division, once accepted, changes everything. With two American states occupying the same continent, peace would gradually settle into rivalry. Geography ensured it. A long shared border would remain active with trade, migration, and military planning, each movement carrying implications for security. Neither government would seek war, but neither could afford to assume the other would remain benign. The greatest source of tension would lie to the west. Territories beyond the Mississippi were still forming, and expansion remained essential to national security for both states. For the Union, Western growth promised markets, resources, and cohesion. For the Confederacy, it offered a way to offset internal constraint by projecting strength outward. These aims were not identical, and they would collide even without formal confrontation. Competition would most often appear indirectly. Rail routes, settlement incentives, and local authority would become tools of influence. Militias and settlers would operate in spaces where jurisdiction was unclear, and incidents would accumulate without clear responsibility. Each episode would test restraint, demanding diplomacy to prevent escalation rather than victory to impose resolution. Foreign policy would intensify these pressures. Both states would seek advantage abroad, aware that alliances could alter the balance at home. External powers would find opportunity in American division, leveraging trade and recognition to extract concessions. What might have been domestic development would now be shaped by international calculation. Over time, this rivalry would impose limits on both nations. Defense and deterrence would absorb resources that might otherwise fuel growth. Political leaders would govern with constant reference to the other side's reactions. Even cooperation would be strategic, measured against the risk of dependence. The result would be a continent stable enough to avoid frequent war, yet tense enough to prevent unity of purpose. Two American states would coexist not as partners, but as constraints on one another, each shaping the other's choices, ambitions, and fears. In place of a single rising power, there would be balance, caution, and an enduring sense of unfinished conflict. Over time, the consequences of division would become visible beyond North America. A continent that might have produced a single dominant power would instead yield two states, each constrained by the other's presence. This would not halt growth, but it would cap ambition. Power that might have been concentrated would now be divided, duplicated, and often neutralized. Industrialization would continue on both sides, but without the advantages of scale and coordination. The Union retained much of the industrial base, yet its markets were smaller and its strategic depth reduced. The Confederacy, slower to modernize and burdened by internal control, would struggle to keep pace. Together, they would remain significant, but neither would achieve the momentum that comes from unity. This fragmentation would shape foreign policy. Overseas commitments would be approached cautiously, always weighed against vulnerabilities at home. Military planning would prioritize continental security over global projection. European powers, facing less pressure from across the Atlantic, would retain influence longer, shaping trade routes, alliances, and conflicts with fewer constraints. The Western Hemisphere would reflect this shift. Without a single American voice to dominate regional affairs, influence would be negotiated rather than imposed. Smaller states would gain room to maneuver among competing powers. Intervention would be possible, but rarely decisive. The absence of overwhelming American presence would not create stability, but it would alter the balance of power. Technological and military development would follow a similar pattern. Innovation would proceed, but rivalry would replace integration. Resources would be spent maintaining balance rather than achieving advantage. Progress would be incremental, guided by caution instead of confidence. In this world, American influence would still matter, but it would arrive later, reach less far, and carry less weight. The outcome of the Civil War would echo not as catastrophe, but as constraint. What was lost was not survival, but possibility, the capacity to shape events beyond the continent without first negotiating division at home. By the time these patterns settled into place, the meaning of a Southern victory would look very different from what its architects had imagined in 1861. Independence would have been achieved, but it would not have delivered resolution. The war would end, yet the forces that produced it would continue to shape both nations long after the fighting stopped. For the Confederacy, sovereignty would bring permanence without security. The state would exist, recognized and defended, but always under pressure, economically constrained, diplomatically cautious, and internally vigilant. The institution it had fought to preserve would either isolate it from the world or force compromises that weakened its original purpose. Independence would protect borders, but it would not quiet uncertainty. For the Union, loss would recalibrate ambition rather than erase power. The United States would endure, industrialize, and expand, but with a different understanding of itself. Unity would no longer be assumed. Federal authority would remain strong, yet permanently tempered by the knowledge that force had failed to hold the nation together once before. Together, the two American states would define a narrower future than either had intended. Their rivalry would limit their reach, their coexistence would demand restraint, and their shared history would ensure that neither could fully escape the consequences of separation. Stability would replace momentum, balance would replace dominance. This is what a Southern victory would ultimately produce. Not triumph and not collapse, but a slower, more constrained path forward, one shaped by endurance rather than resolution. The war would have been won in the narrow sense that independence was secured. But the question that defined the conflict, how much a nation could hold together under pressure, would remain unanswered, embedded not in memory, but in the structure of the world that followed.